At PDC, we offer more than 20 professional academic credentials in a broad range of subjects. Our goal is to transform the lives and careers of diverse lifelong learners by providing access to engage and personalized professional education for all. Next, I would like to introduce today's speaker, Stuart Brown. Stuart Brown is an adjunct faculty member at Georgetown University and a principal at Dunrick Partners, a management consultant firm headquartered in Pennsylvania. He previously held consulting positions with Booz Allen Hamilton and Toffler Associates in the Washington, D.C. area. He is a retired U.S. Army colonel. During his active duty, he held command and staff positions in the U.S., abroad, and at the Pentagon. He has held senior executive positions in the banking and commercial real estate industries, including as the senior real estate credit officer in the Select Client Division at Citibank. In addition, he has served as director on 5 boards of directors in the banking, hospitality, commercial real estate, and retirement community industries. I would like to now introduce you all to today's speaker, Stuart Brown.
Thank you, Elisa. I appreciate that. I'd like to start off with asking a couple of questions. Have you ever seen someone make a decision that seemed to be rushed and not too well thought through? Or have you ever seen a decision made by someone and wondered, how did they ever arrive at that conclusion? Or more personally, have you ever made a decision yourself and after some thought, wish you'd spent some more time on it? Well, we here at Georgetown had a series of conversations over the last several months about this kind of thing. And we decided that we ought to provide something in our academic offering. So we created a course called Thinking to Thrive, which I'm very pleased to say that I get to teach. And that Thinking to Thrive tackles the art and science of decision-making with the goal of helping our students think about how they think so they'll be better decision makers. In this course, we discuss 20 some odd different decision processes and tools. But here today, because of the time constraints, obviously, we're going to talk about 2 of those related decision processes. One we call the natural decision process and its derivative, the decision grid. Next, please. So we make hundreds of decisions every day. Some of them are non-consequential. They're little decisions like, what shirt should I wear? Should I have the glazed donut or the chocolate one? Obviously, the decision is the chocolate one. Some are routine decisions, those that could be handled by, some sort of, hang on a second here. Let me get that out of the way. Some sort of rule of thumb, standard operating procedure, or standard process. Some are complex, like sending people to the moon. A million moving pieces, trying to make that all work. Some are complex and unique, what we might call wicked problems, like trying to decide how best to handle the coronavirus. Some have small impacts and some have massive ramifications. Next slide, please. So this is the question. How do we make the best decisions for the situations at hand? This is a very big question, which would require a lot more time than we have today. So as I said, we're only going to talk about 2 of the processes that we talk about in our class. Next slide. There's a lot of different processes we can use to make decisions. The natural decision process is made up of that process that's really hardwired. The fight or flight response, which are responses to threats, attacks, or something that we usually fear. And part of the natural decision process are what we call heuristics. And these are the decision strategies derived from previous experiences or similar kinds of problems. Heuristics are simple rules that we have learned or have been drilled into us by evolutionary process of our life experiences. Heuristics are shortcuts. They're the easy part. They are the shortcut decision methodology. They provide good enough solutions for most of our problems. But heuristics don't usually involve much conscious thought. Next slide. So this natural decision process is okay for a lot of things, and it's a disaster for some others. And the reason is that the natural decision process is really too simple to handle complex decisions. It's too easily influenced by emotion, bias, and fear. It's lacking in intellectual rigor most of the time. It's often done too quickly, way too quickly. It's not transparent. The decisions are usually all within your own head. It's often unstructured, it's rarely documented, and it's sometimes irrational. And it's the cause of many of our bad decisions. Next slide. So what we did is we took the natural decision process and we broke it down into its very basic elements. And we wanted to see what should be going on. And some of this goes on, but not necessarily in an order or structured fashion. But we determined that clearly, step one in any process of a decision is identifying and clarifying the problem or issue. Not always well done in the natural decision process, but it has to be done to some level. Then they have to develop criteria for the decision process. There have to be factors upon which you're going to make your decision. You need to weight the criteria. There'll be more about that later. Developing the choices or courses of action, and that can be done in any one of a number of ways. Scoring each one of the choices or courses of action. Somehow or other, we need to differentiate them. And multiplying the scores for each choice by the weight of each criteria, which is clearly not necessarily done neatly in the natural decision process. The results need to be tabulated, and then it needs to be reviewed, socialized, and adjusted for the results. Next slide. So when we finished this process, we ended up with something we called the decision grid. A little story behind this. We developed this when I was doing some consulting for a government agency that was having a lot of difficulty getting their budgets approved. They would take their budgets up to their agency heads and they would be asked to explain their decisions and they would get rejected. They didn't really have a way to do this. They were just using the natural decision process. Well, this looks like a logical thing to do. So we helped them build this. And once they put the decision grid into place, they had pretty much no more problems. They were able to defend what they said, what they decided, and things were pretty easy. And the reasons are the steps in the natural decision process, in the decision grid, are transparent in their construction and content. They're objectively stated. They're less easily influenced by emotion, bias, and fear. They're developed with intellectual rigor. It's a structured process. It's documented, less prone to irrationality, although that can always creep in because we've got humans involved, and it's capable of handling complex issues. So the decision grid can handle and solve a lot of the problems that the natural decision process doesn't do so well. Next slide. So this is what the actual basic grid looks like. It's got 4 parts to it. The criteria, click. Waiting for the criteria, click. Choices, click. And the totals, click. Now these are the 4 sections. You can do this any way you want to. We've laid this out in Microsoft Excel because it's a very simple process. And this is the way we're going to deal with it here. Let's go to the next slide. So the first thing we got to do is we got to determine the criteria. You can see those over here on the left. The criteria are cost, expected return on investment, time, complexity, strategic, resources, risk, and reputation. Now, this is just one standard set of criteria. We'll talk about other ones as we go along. But the criteria, once again, are the elements that you're going to use to make these decisions. These are the factors that when judged individually and added up will actually form the decision. The criteria can be selected in any one of a number of ways. You can do it by yourself, which I don't suggest. You could do it with a small group, not the best, but better. You can refer to 2 or 3 senior executives or leaders in your organization. Better, but maybe not the best. My preference is to do this with a group formed from people from the principal stakeholders to ensure that all the various constituencies are involved and represented. You'll also get to know what's important to which group. And the discussion around the criteria is always a good way to get to know further the organization, its priorities and balance and biases. So the development choice of the criteria is up to you. But since consistency has some value, I often suggest to organizations that they develop a number of standard criteria sets. One for projects, another for financial decisions, another one for IT decisions, another one for HR related issues, and so forth and so on. It doesn't always work, but again, having some consistency is better. Now I'd like to talk for a couple of seconds about the stuff that's in the box over here on the left. In this case, we've decided that there are 8 criteria. And I want to point out that although we have a number of criteria, they are each different. So for instance, the criteria of cost, less cost is going to be better. And the expected ROI, return on investment, a higher ROI is better. Time, less is better. Complexity, less is better, and so forth and so on. This is important when we start to put numbers to it in weighting. So let's go ahead and do that on the next slide. So weighting criteria really does nothing more than indicate which criteria are more or less important and putting a number to that value. Here, we provide weights for each of the criteria using numerical values, and we're using a base 10. That is 1 through 10. So we're going to technically put a number, a value, if you would, on each one of these 8 criteria of 1 to 10. But I got to warn you, don't use 0 in this calculation. A lot of people want to go 0 to 10. Don't do that. If you use 0, you get some very wacky decisions. Again, my favorite method for developing the weights is the same as we did for the criteria. Get a group of people around the table, maybe the same people that help you develop the criteria, and discuss how important things are. Now, again, let's take a look at a couple of quick examples. And you can see that cost is rated as 7. So what exactly does that mean? Okay, now the higher the number, the more important. If you take a look at the salmon colored box down below, it's got more of an explanation. Weights 1 to 10, with 10 being the most valuable to the organization. Scores 1 to 10, with 10 being the most valuable again. So the highest score is best. So with cost, the least cost is best. Okay, so that means the higher score is the least cost. This gets a little confusing. So when we have a cost rated at 7, that means that that is more important in this particular case. When we're talking about the weighting, that's an important thing because it's above 5. Now, if we go on and take a look at time, which is rated as a 5 in this particular thing, okay, that's less important than cost in this decision process, according to the people who put it together. So again, you can begin to see the functionality here. Again, highest score is best. So let's go to the next slide. In this case, we're going to be scoring the choices. Each one of these choices or courses of action are different in some fashion or another. Each will have a different set of attributes in each of the criteria areas. And it's these attributes that we score in each of the criteria rows. So you can see that we've filled it in. So again, let's take a look at an example. In course of action 1, we have scored cost as a 7. Now, that means that the cost of this choice or course of action is less than the average cost, so that's a good thing. Remember now, the highest number is the best choice. So a 7 actually indicates that the cost is less than the average. So if you go down and you take a look, and course of action 2, where cost is scored as a 3, that means that the cost for course of action 3 is going to be higher than it was in number 1. A little confusing, but when we get to the numbers and the multiplication, you'll see why this is necessary. So course of action 2 scored a 3 is more expensive than course of action number 1 scored as a 7. That's the way that works out. And we do that for each and every one of these areas. We do one for cost, experience, time, complexity, et cetera, for each one of the courses of action or choices. And then we go to the next slide. And in this case, there's a couple of multiplications. In this step, we're going to multiply the value of the weighting for each criteria by the value of each score. Click. There we go. In this case, we're going to do the example of expected ROI. So I'm multiplying 9 times click, 6. So we're multiplying the weighting times the score, click, and we get 54. And you repeat this process for each and every one of these, and then click, we have tabulations at the bottom. So you can see that when we're all finished with this math, we do the weighting times the score, gives us totals and the totals across the bottom, that we have 3 different numbers, numeric values, if you would, for each one of the choices or courses of action. Course of action number 1, 373, 2, 320, and 4, excuse me, number 3 is 403. So next page, please. So here you can see the highest numerical value for the totals. Course of action number 3 is the winner. And this is what we call the indicated decision. And we're going to talk more about that in a couple of seconds, but it's very important to point out that this is an indicated decision and not the end of the process. Next slide, please. It's really imperative that the result from this decision grid be reviewed and socialized with the team that developed the courses of action and choices, and the person or persons who are going to make a final decision. because this decision grid will often return an answer that is unexpected and may cause conflict because there have been hidden or unspoken criteria, weighting, or scoring, which will lead to some people to different decisions. And sometimes the leadership, the people involved, don't want to make their decisions completely public. This is obviously a political issue, something that you need to be aware of. The decision grid is a tool and a process to help you make decisions. It should not be expected to make the decision for you. We learned this lesson the hard way. First time I think we used this process where we had a problem, again, as a consultant, we were working with a small city here on the East Coast. And we were doing some background work for their strategic plan. And it required us to prioritize, which the decision grid is built for, prioritizing or choosing, their customers. And they had gone through a process to develop their customer list. And then they put together the decision grid, and they'd done the criteria, and they'd done the weighting and all this. And we went through the process, and we unveiled it. And we unveiled it on, I think it was a Wednesday morning for a meeting, and the mayor came to join us. Normally, the mayor was not part of the process. He was being informed in the background and kept current. But he came to this, and as we unveiled the decision of who was the most important customer to this little city, it turned out to be real estate developers. And of course, that was totally opposite from the political decision, which was it's always going to be the voters and the taxpayers. You know, they clearly are the most important people, but it wasn't. The way they put their decision grid together, the way they built their criteria, and they weighted it, and they did the scoring, it was very clear. The real estate developers were runaway winners, primarily because they provided a great deal of money to the city. Well, this was totally unacceptable to the mayor. He stood up in the middle of the meeting, basically slammed his fist on the desk and said some rather unkind things about us, and he stalked out of the room. So I looked at my partner, and he looked back at me, and we kind of went, okay, well, I guess we're done here. And on the way back, it was a several-hour trip to get back to our office. We really wondered if we'd ever get paid. By the time we got back to our office, we had a phone call from the mayor's assistant, and could we please come back up the next morning for a very early morning meeting. Early morning meetings were really tough because it was about a 2.5, 3-hour drive. But we were there at 8 o'clock, and we sat down with the mayor and his senior assistant. He closed the door, and it was quiet. And he said he wanted to apologize to us, that he didn't really understand the process. But in fact, what had happened here was entirely correct. And it would obviously inform their strategic planning process, but this was an answer that could not be made public. If the voting and the voters and the taxpayers ever figured that they were less than number one on the list, he figured he'd have a revolt on his hands. So you can see there were unspoken and hidden criteria here that would change things. We've worked with other government organizations where the leadership was kept informed, and they approved everything else, and they still found the results shocking. So you really need to pay attention to this on the political end when you use this. It's a wonderful tool, but you got to socialize it, or you could get into real trouble. Next slide, please. So how is the decision grid best employed? It clearly is a method for prioritizing or deciding amongst different choices of courses of action. It is highly functional. It's also great as a documented and transparent record of the decision process. The documentation and transparency are really important. As a platform for the discussion to help dimension an issue and then develop a criteria and weighting needed to make decisions about the issue, it is fantastic. It forms a great platform for this kind of discussion. It's also a framework for working through the decision process with a group. You can get everybody's input, and as a result, you usually have better buy-in on the end. It's also a tool to ferret out hidden criteria, agendas, and biases in the decision process. We found it very effective, but you need to, again, realize that it's a tool. It's not an answer in and of itself. And it's sometimes because people will not be totally honest with you about what their agenda is, or what their criteria or their weighting is. It may produce answers that cause a little bit of conflict. But it's a highly useful tool. We've introduced it to lots of our customers. I'm currently using it with a couple of people right now. And we've also made this decision grid available to you in Microsoft Excel. Should any of you like to have a copy of it, all you need to do is drop me a line and I'll be happy to send it to you. Next slide, please. And this is my contact information right here. And I want to thank everybody for spending some time with us. And I think I'm about right on target now. And we can go ahead and take some questions and answers. Back to you, Jeff, or Elisa, or whoever.
Thank you so much, Stuart, for that wonderful presentation. We have about 30 people on the line right now, and if anybody has any questions for Stuart, please feel free to type them right into the question and answer box or directly into the chat. And we do have one person who asks if we'll be sharing this presentation, and with Stuart's permission, we certainly will, and we are recording today's session, which we will also share with everybody.
Okay, good.
Wonderful. We have a few questions coming in, which is great. You guys
Sure.
keep typing them in and we'll answer the ones that we can. So first question, Stuart, what effect does corporate culture have on influencing the graduate?
Well, culture trumps everything. And that's one of the joys and the traps of the decision grid in and of itself. If you get people into a room and you can get them to talk to you relatively honestly and actually get the criteria down on paper, out of their brains onto paper, and then convince them to work through the weighting and the scoring process, you'll have a pretty clean, relatively objective decision process. However, depending on the kind of organization that you work in, that kind of honesty may not be possible. I worked for several years at Citibank, and this decision grid would be very hard to utilize there. We had layers of politics internal to Citibank that rivaled Renaissance Italy. It was very steep. So the culture always has a major impact. But again, you can use this decision grid to try and flush out some of those hidden criteria. You just need to be careful about how you do it. Hopefully that answers your question.
Thank you so much. Our next question comes from Matt, and he's asking, do you have any thoughts on how to develop a set of alternatives or options to weigh against each other? And he also says, great presentation.
Read the question to me again. I want to make sure I answer the right thing.
Sure. Any thoughts on how to develop a set of alternatives or options to weigh against each other?
Okay, so if you're referring to how do we develop the choices and the courses of action, there's dozens of different ways to do that. There is the standard seminar method where you literally get the smart people around the table and you flesh out what the questions are, and you put them all up against the wall, and then you go through a process of editing and cleaning them out and sorting them and so forth and so on. There are the various thinking processes, inductive, deductive, abductive, and so forth, that you can use to work through putting together and developing the different courses of action. I happen to be a very big fan of using the military decision-making process because that requires you to go through this very similar process. There's lots of different ways and really more than we can cover here. So what you'll have to do is you'll have to come take the course, Thinking to Thrive, where we cover many more of them in some more depth. There we go. Paid advertisement nonetheless.
Thank you so much. Next, we have Judy and John, and they're wondering, have you ever experienced the decision matrix not working or giving a type of false positive?
The answer is yes. But again, since my utilization of the decision grid has primarily been as a facilitator, as the consultant. I was the one working with the group to get them to build the grid, to provide the criteria, to provide the weighting, to do the scoring. And as I say, and I pointed out several times, they will often come up with an answer that is different than the crowd expects because they personally, in their more natural decision process, were using a different set of criteria or not going through the details that we've done here. If the criteria are well developed, if the weighting is well thought through, and the scoring is done diligently, the chances of having a false positive, so to speak, or coming to a decision that is significantly improper, I think is very low. However, as I mentioned before, there's the social problems, the political problems, the organizational difficulties of getting everybody to admit what their real criteria are, what their real scoring and their real weighting really is. So that's more the problem than the process itself. But again, I will emphasize that the decision grid is a tool. It's not going to solve all your problems. It's not going to make the decision for you, but it will lead to a very good discussion and hopefully a better decision in the end. Again, I hope that answers your question.
Great. Thank you so much, Stuart. We probably have time for another question or two. So the next question is from Cullen. He first says, great briefing and excellent tool. And his question is, would you recommend doing this exercise once without leaders and then again with leaders?
I'm going to answer that in a squishy consultancy kind of way. Depends on who the leaders are. In some organizations, the leaders are very open to this kind of thought process. And this is what I prefer to do. I sit down with the leadership and we brief them along with the team that's doing the work and say, these are some of the tools that we're going to use. And, here's some of the good news and the bad news about it. And, make sure that they understand what's going on. Anytime that you're in a decision process or you are working through strategic planning, which we've done a great deal of, you need to make sure that everybody's informed, because if they are not, you'll run into the problems that I mentioned before, where you get to the final thing and you roll it out and everybody goes, oh my God, what's this? Which is the last thing you want to have happen. You want to have everybody basically on board. And the way you do that is you don't start with the big final decision. You engage them up front. You make them part of the process as well as part of the problem. So some leaders are up on that and are interested in the detail of the process. A lot of them, on the other hand, are not. They just want to see the final piece. But again, it's very important, I think, that they at least understand the basics of the process so there are very few surprises. Surprises aren't good when you're working with senior leadership. Again, I hope that answers your question.
Great. Thank you so much. We have a comment from Doug, and he would like you to respond if you don't mind. The comment is that decision makers need to be careful about staff manipulating and weighing to get the answer they want, and then using the tool to prove their point.
Yes, he's right. That can be. If there's an adversarial situation that exists between, say, the staff and the leadership, it is quite possible for the staff, who, by the way, usually form the team that is doing the hard work, the heavy lifting on this kind of stuff. Staff is presenting to senior leaders the decisions that they've made. It can be used to support a different position. That goes back to why it's so important to make sure that the leadership is fully informed about what you're doing and how you're doing it, so that there won't be any surprises. There's been a couple of times along the line where we've had decisions coming from a lower ranking staff, if you would, going back up to the leadership. And we as the outsiders, as the consultants, took a look at this and said, oh, could be a problem. And then you're faced with a situation as the outsider, do you pre-brief the leadership? And that's always a tough one. I don't have a standard set of answers for that one. You kind of need to deal with that one based on the personalities and the organizational DNA. There are some organizations that are very open to discussion and conflict and different ideas, and there are other ones that aren't. You need to make that decision based on what you think the environment looks like. And I candidly don't have a canned answer for you. Thank you, Doug. I appreciate that. Good question.
So we have time to go till 12:45. Stuart, if you're available.
Sure.
Great. So we have a sort of complex question, which I'll just go ahead and read as written because it's a little bit out of my experience. So Matt asks, do you recommend a blind voting process when coming up with the weighing per criteria and gathering the 1 to 10 ratings on each criteria? And he suggests that this would be a good way to avoid groupthink or following the leader.
And the answer is yes, we've used both. I, in general, prefer to do the seminar method where everybody discusses the answer and we try to come to some consensus. On the other hand, that's sometimes impossible. Maybe that's too difficult because your people are spread across a geography that is too distant to get them work synchronously. We've had situations where we've had people in 5 and 6 time zones, and that's very hard to coordinate. If you have a situation where people are voting individually, you're bound to get some very interesting answers and some very different ones. So then the question is the facilitator, as the guy trying to pull this together, how do you balance that? How do you take, let's say you've got a group of 10 different people and you've got 10 separate answers, and some of them are sincerely divergent from the others, so that there is no one clear path about what this decision on what this weight should be or what this score should be. The methodology there gets to be more difficult. Again, and that leads me for my preference of doing it synchronously, same people in the room, if we can possibly do it. On the other hand, because of the organizational DNA of some organizations, where they are uncomfortable about having those conversations in public, you may have to resort to the latter, so private voting. But as I say, that leaves you with a very interesting mathematical problem. Do you just take straight averages? That may or may not give you the answer. Do you look for some multiplicative event? What, it's a very difficult problem. It brings up different problems. I don't have a clear solution for that one, to be candid with you. Every time we've been faced with it, we've looked at the situation, the backdrop, the people involved, and tried to structure something that made sense. We weren't always successful, I'll be honest with you. That's a trick question. That's good.
Thank you so much, Stuart. We have another question here.
Sure.
Have you ever run into an experience where people within the organization didn't want to use the grid and preferred making sort of a gut decision?
Yes. That's sincerely problematic. If you have a group that rejects the transparency of the numerization, the objectivity of the grid as a concept, that's a serious statement about the organizational DNA. And as I said, there are plenty of organizations where being candid and being transparent is not the road to success. Again, I state my personal experience at Citibank. Very good, very well thought of organization, pretty successful in many cases, not so successful in some others. But their organizational DNA did not permit you, well, I won't say didn't permit you. You needed to realize that you were going to be risking a great deal if you were entirely open and candid and full with your answers. You just couldn't be candid. So again, if you've got a group that fails to do this, then it's probably time for a deeper discussion and find out why. I've never had a group specifically refuse to use it. I have had groups that I knew tried to game it on me, and people who tried to game it on me to get their own agenda in place. But I've never had a group refuse it. So I don't have firsthand experience, but that's an interesting question. I have to think more about that.
Thank you so much, Stuart. Our next question is, have you ever tried doing a sensitivity analysis on the weighing to see whether or not small changes in the weighing change the results? This might prove greater or lesser confidence in the results.
Read that again. Can you read the question again for me, Elise?
Have you ever tried doing a sensitivity analysis on the weighing to see whether or not small changes in the weighing changed the results?
I've never done that analysis, but the answer is obviously, since it's a straight multiplicative arithmetic event, changes in the weighting or changes in the scoring can have relatively dramatic events. Excuse me, ramifications. If you take 5 to a 7, that will change things. Now that's in a base 10. I've had people put together these grids on a base 100, 1 through 100. So obviously a change at that point from a 5 to a 7 wouldn't make any difference. So it's the percentage differential, and the answer is it clearly will make a difference. But I've never had anybody particularly tweak it that hard. Although, let me retract that partly. We've had a number of discussions where we put together the grid and we've done a first cut at the decision using the decision grid. And it's come out, the group wasn't really happy with it. So they go back and they may rearrange, tweak, if you would, the weights and some of the scores to come out with answers that seem more logical. Now, whether those are more logical, more rational, and more where they're supposed to be, or whether people are attempting a game, it's always hard to figure out. So the math is fairly straightforward. We don't do anything more complex than multiplication. So it does have an effect. Another good question. Sensitivity analysis. Good.
Thanks so much, Stuart, for your time and for your wonderful knowledge. That wraps up the questions from the audience. If
Okay.
anybody would like to type anything, any last comments or discussion notes, please do. And we will be sharing this recording with everybody.
Okay. Once again, if anybody'd like to have this little tool, it's easy enough to build for yourself, but if you'd like to have it, drop me an email. It's right here. I'd be more than happy to send it to you. And other than that, may all your decisions be good ones. Thank you very much for your time.